Welcome, data enthusiasts. My name is Joseph. I'm co-founder of Zuma Recruitment, the consultancy focused 100% on data tech professionals in and around the Berlin region. This is our podcast, Data for Good, connecting you with all things data. Today, we're joined by Marc Roulet, Director of Analytics, Research and SEO at XING. XING, you probably know, is a social network for business and career with more than 21 million members. So as you can imagine, data is pretty important to Marc and the team. Hey, Marc, how's it going today?
Hi, Joseph. Thanks for having me on your podcast. Doing very well.
Good to hear it. It's Friday and it is a new year and a new start. So yeah, welcome.
Exactly. I think first 2 weeks still justifies Happy New Year. So Happy New Year to you.
Cool. And to give people a little bit of extra context, we've had a few conversations, of course, but you're setting your backdrop, the bunker there. Where are you?
Yeah, my bunker. I'm located in Berlin, and this is actually my cellar. I would have never dreamed a few years ago that I would be working out of a cellar, but you know, COVID does weird things to you, and I've come to appreciate it. I think I have the shortest commute ever because I'm not in my actual apartment. It takes me about 10 seconds to go to work, so it's actually kind of nice.
Yeah, I love it. I think it's a great idea, and being in the cellar gives you that extra feeling of being cut off, get into deep work and deep concentration. So yeah, I'm a big fan of it, as you well know.
That's correct, and I have the added advantage of fitness is right there and the wine's right behind.
Right,
I'm good to go.
And it's Friday.
Exactly, and it's Friday.
Cool. So today, before we go too far off topic, I understand you would like to talk about data visualization and why it's so important in analytics, and me too. So I'm really interested in this. So yeah, thanks for giving us the time today. Before we get into that, Before we get into that, let's go back, giving people a bit of context as to your connection to data. We ask this of all our guests. How did you first connect with the power of data? When was that first touch point for you when you realized this is powerful?
You know, to be completely honest, that came pretty late. I did not have that connection to data when I, for instance, was in high school, not even in university. I understood that data is important, and originally I thought I would have a career in finance, which is numbers, but it's different. It's not data, right? And I actually just kind of moved into data by coincidence in my first job at eBay, and where I was then an analyst and I was extracting data, and that's interesting, and it's the basis for most analytical work. But that real power of data, and that's, I believe, also why this question of visualization of data appeals so much to me, actually happened in that later stage, right? I realized going into conversations with stakeholders, with managers, with business leaders, it didn't matter who it was, the visualization and the data made all the difference. It was this really interesting kind of sweet spot in an organization, is everybody always turns to the person that has the data. And that's where I realized the power of data, right? And that's why I've turned, I believe, I try to call myself a data evangelist, because I think the analyst and the person that really understands the data is the trusted source that drives decisions that other people are making. People will mostly not take decisions without being informed, and a foundation for that decision making is the data. And then, to the point of this podcast, visualizing that in the right way makes the world of difference to a decision maker to understand, to create clarity. And I realized that probably within the first 6 months of my job, because every time I actually took the data and I visualized it in a meaningful way, and it was easy to understand, people were just like, yeah, okay, makes total sense. Let's do this. If it didn't, I just kind of provided too many numbers, people were overwhelmed, mostly. Just, I don't understand this. And then the data was not used for decision making. And that's ultimately what it should be doing, depending on context. Data scientists build models that then they don't drive decisions, they drive product experiences. But if you come from a traditional analytics background, what you're doing is you're facilitating decision making and transparency, right?
Yeah. So awesome. And it makes all the difference for people like me who are not engineers or analysts in the data space, but certainly need the power of data or need data to make decisions. So yeah, that's great connection. And looking at what we're here to talk about, visualization specifically, and its power, starting at the top or high level, how can visualization, how can it help to steer a company's goals and their strategy?
Yeah, so that's a good question. In like, what impact, I read that as what impact does it have for the business? And there's different levels. I think I'm also very explicit on how important KPIs are, because KPIs steer entire businesses. Like, people focus on whatever they're told to do. If you say this is what we're focused on, everybody will do it. Then visualizing that and the path, how to get there, what's our gap to target, all of these things help facilitate decision making if we're on the right track. So that's the reporting component of visualization, right? In terms of dashboards, performance metrics, these type of things. Then on a more operational level, for business units, for product managers, for decision makers, for project managers, I think the visualization helps steer any major decision that happens in a business. You almost always have somebody reviewing a slide deck, a storyline, and in there you will have, if it's a good deck, you will have visualizations, because it helps inform people about the situation that we're in, the potential that a new business has, the uplift that we saw through the product that we rolled out. You name it. It doesn't matter what it is. You'll always have data in it. And if you want to convince somebody, and that's mostly what people do in business, right? They want to get in further investments. They need additional headcounts, whatever it is. If you visualize it well, it'll be easier to convince your counterpart. And that can take a turn to the negative. Just to quickly dive into it, what I'm trying to say is you don't want your analyst to be a lawyer. People shouldn't come and bring an analyst and say, but my numbers, your numbers. But ultimately, that's what analysts and data always do. They help drive informed decision making. And if you do good decision making through transparency, you're making the better decision, which in turn should drive more growth, more business, a healthier environment for everyone, right? And so that's why data is so fundamental. And then in turn, again, the visualization really is. I like to compare it to, like, analysts oftentimes like to focus just on the technical part, the SQL, the querying, the modeling, the statistics, the data processing. But if I would compare that, maybe for instance, to a sculptor, it's, you have to know what kind of rock you use, what kind of chisel, what kind of hammer. Those are your tools. But I do truly believe that analytics is more an art than a science, because you can have all these tools and you can still make a really, really ugly sculpture. And then people won't like it. They won't use it. They'll walk past it.
So,
and that visual. Go ahead.
Sorry, you might also argue that different tools for different needs.
Of
different
course,
tools
right?
For different situations, like the finance department will have different needs to the marketing department, and perhaps different tools resonate with those different departments at different times. And then part of the analyst is about understanding the people that need the data. So adapting and chiseling, as you say, for those needs.
Well, that's a good point. And those are actually two different dimensions. One of them is, who's your audience? What are you visualizing for? And there you need very different types of visuals. Do you need a report, a dashboard, a deep dive? Is it do you actually need a chart? Do you need a graph? What is it? But then it's also, what data do you have? Because that'll tell you how you need to visualize it. Like what are you actually trying to do? There are, I'd say, standards depending on, are you looking at time series data? Are you looking at ranking data? Are you trying to look at distribution? And these are just like basic things that you should be knowing.
Okay.
When you go into visualization.
Yeah.
And then one last, and then it's even important, how do you make it look? Because it should be visually appealing. And that also different use cases for different audiences there. Right?
This topic can go so broad, or I can go into lots of different areas of importance. You've just gone into 3 different areas: the audience, the actual data, and then how to visualize it. I'm thinking to marry those parts together, or I'm actually thinking of a data analyst who's often charged with working for different teams and different departments to achieve different things. To bring that all together, what would be, or do you believe there are fundamental guidelines that analysts should follow when visualizing data? And if so, what would they be? Or should they completely mix it up each time?
No, what I try to do for myself, and I try to also provide that guidance to my analysts or my teams when thinking about visualization, is in, I'd say, 3 different segments. One of them is dashboards, visualization for reporting purposes, for recurring things, because that is a very specific use case where it's a lot about the interactivity of numbers. You can use the power of the mouse click, right? You can hover over, you can click into the next level, you can go to one detail, you can zoom in, zoom out. And that is a very different use case. And there it's really important to sit down with your stakeholder and understand what are the needs that they have, and how do you then create basically an entire narrative in one page. But it can be interactive.
Can you give an example? As in, could you relate that to XING or any other social networking service?
Sure. So I just today had a conversation about, do we need 1 or 4 graphs to support the mouse over directionality when flipping through different key KPIs for a business? And the answer there was, we need 4, because we have 4 units that we're trying to provide a visual kind of steering dashboard for. And each one of them in itself is good to be able to compare them. If you're only looking at 1 KPI and then you want the trend, then one graph is sufficient. If you have 4 that you want to compare against, or you actually have an overarching manager that wants oversight across all 4 and then needs to see the historical development, while at the same time also having the just in your face current status, year-over-year development, and versus target performance, where you need then visual cues like traffic light and just percentage value, where you want to show the number, but at the same time you need the historical trend. How do you bring that all together? And that would be an example of where it's important to understand your business context that you're building this in, and how to use the flexibility of tools like Power BI, Looker, Tableau, MicroStrategy. I don't care which tool. At the end of the day, they have their pros and cons, but it goes down the same path. So that's the first use case to me, is reporting and dashboards. And the second one is deep dives. So things that mostly end up in a PowerPoint presentation, because every chart, every graph is static. You build it once, it doesn't change. It's there. And it's there to support a storyline, something that either you're trying to tell yourself because you were tasked, analyst is tasked with understanding why there was a deviation in a certain KPI performance, and then you have to start breaking it down into the different segments that you have, and the different approaches that you took from the user perspective, from the platform perspective, from the segmentation perspective, whatever you have. You have one chart, and there, I think that the aesthetics of the chart or the graph is even more important than in the dashboard. I've seen dashboards that are pretty ugly, but they still convey the message. They still provide the information that you need.
And also, crucially, that the user or the receiver is able to interpret that and take the value that they need from it. It's all very well that it looks sexy, it looks great for you making it, but again, your audience.
Yeah, and there, I kind of like to work by the principle. There's maybe the thought leader around visualization, Edward Tufte. It says content is information, any content. So if you have a screen and you show something, anything in there is information, and it's a conscious decision. Do you need the lines? Do you need the graphs? Do you need the color space? Do you need the outline? Do you need the support grid lines? It's all a conscious decision, and people should be aware that no matter what they do, everything in there is then giving information to your recipient. And as I stated at the beginning, I think data and its visualization is there to help stakeholders make better decisions. And they have a limited amount of time to process the information that they have. And graphs do that very well if you do it right. If you do it wrong, you overwhelm the person. They can't see what you're trying to highlight. They don't understand the point you're trying to make. They'll interpret whatever they want, and then they don't make the right decision.
Have you seen it done wrong, as you say, incorrectly?
A million times. Really, like literally a million times. There's so many things we can do wrong. It starts with basics of you're actually trying to show a development over time, a trend, but you decide to not omit the absolute value on every data point in your graph, which makes it like really hard to read and really busy. And people start focusing on that information. They'll go in and be like, okay, that says now 12,645,389.
Even though they requested something different from the beginning. So again, it's about recognizing your audience and what they actually need, and cutting the noise out, simplifying it.
Yeah, whereas oftentimes the stakeholder will not be able to tell you what they need. They have to give the business question. If the stakeholder starts trying to provide you with, I want this type of graph, it's never going to work. I don't think I've ever had a conversation with a stakeholder. Let's go back to reports and dashboard. I don't think I've ever had a conversation with a stakeholder where they were able to kind of communicate in a simplified version what they want, because ultimately they'll say, I want everything. I want to know everything in here. And if you build that and provide exactly everything, they'll sit down, look at it and say, oh, this is overwhelming. I can't work with this. So it's the analyst's job to just understand the broader context of what the person needs, and then put that into visualization in their own mind. And then provide with examples and have a discussion. Say, look, this is how I would do it. Is this going to provide what you need? And then it's an iterative process. And it's the same with an individual graph. Although sorry, you were going to.
Well, I was going to say on this very point, does that idea give credence to the idea of analysts being embedded within functional teams and not within a data team, you know, for the risk of, as you say, the user not understanding what data they need, the analyst should have that really strong business connection and understanding what this business function needs. So back to it, do you think it gives credence to the idea of analysts being embedded in functional departments rather than data departments?
Well, that's going down a entirely different path. Like we could fill an entire podcast with, organizational structure of data teams.
Yeah,
I think the answer is somewhere in between. I think I've seen the best performance in data if that the analytics teams, the data teams are in their own organization, but they're allocated in the sense as what you potentially mean with embedded, like in a matrix function with their respective stakeholder units, because it's important that analysts exchange among each other and have consistency in how they extract data, how they store data. Also learning from each other. I've been in an environment where they did the opposite. They were embedded analysts everywhere, and they just weren't providing value. And then they pulled them together, and then everything worked a lot better. So while
the ability to learn from each other.
Yeah, I agree with the notion that analysts need to be close to their stakeholders to know their needs. I don't think that they should be embedded in terms of just independence. I think analytics is a function that vastly benefits from proximity to each other and being consistent in how you approach things.
Cool. You work for a huge company, and visualization is associated with big data and large companies. We work, and also the Berlin data community is a whole range of tech innovation businesses that are from 50 to 500. I'm wondering, when do you believe a business of 2, of 5, of 15, of or whatever size, when and what should they be visualizing? When should they start visualizing data, and what data should they start visualizing?
That's a really good question. Never thought of it in a kind of scaling perspective. As of when? I would almost say as of day one, because I'm pretty sure this is also part of like the lean startup principles of you need to know your goals. And as soon as you have goals, you have metrics. And as soon as you have metrics, you should be visualizing them. Because visualization starts with a chart, with just a decision of how do you list information in a table. And it also starts with defining your goals and then monitoring your progress against it, either incrementally, with the forecast. I mean, if you're in hypergrowth, I think you have a completely different requirement to your visualization, but you should still be doing it. You should be able to tell your investor or whatever it is, if you're on track. And how do you do that? Hopefully with a visualization, right? And I understand that product development sometimes happens really, really fast because you're still in a completely creative space. And but even there, I would assume you're trying to convince somebody that this is the right thing to do, or maybe you're just doing it. I don't know. That's a different conversation. I've never worked in that.
Yeah, sure.
But in the environment that I worked in, anything you do, somebody has to sign it off. You need to have a conscious decision because you have scarce resources and you want to make sure you allocate them correctly as a business.
In a business like XING, large scale business, and you're now at director level, who should be involved in visualization, both the creation and the decision making? Should everybody be involved, or is it more?
That's a really good question. So what I hear out of that is who should be involved Are you talking specifically only about building or using?
End to end, both.
End to end. Okay. I think that analysts should definitely be in the lead for the visualization. I mentioned that before. I don't think stakeholders should be defining their own visualizations because it more often than not, results in poor quality. But I think
that's interesting. That's a point to note. Thank you for that. Very interesting, especially having come from eBay and XING, two environments that notoriously do it well. So good to know.
And I there's always an exception to the rule. I've seen stakeholders, business managers that are like really, really proficient in data and visualization of data analytics because they have an intrinsic motivation to do that. And that's fine. If you have one of those in your team, great. Of course they can do that. But I think analytics and data visualization has a similar challenge as, for instance, research, another topic that I'm responsible for, which is most people believe they understand it, they have an opinion on it, and they think they can do it. They think it's simple. Draw a chart, put a line chart here, put a bar chart there, done. But it takes some practice, and it takes a certain skill set and a certain mindset to do it right. And that's why I'll try to always get the analyst to do that work, to make that decision. But that doesn't mean that the stakeholders shouldn't be involved in the process, because what can also happen is the opposite, that the analyst, you should never have an analyst just sit in their cubicle and do everything by themselves. And then after weeks of work presented to their stakeholders, like, this is not what I needed at all. It just doesn't help me. It has to be, as I said, an iterative process that'll get you to the result that maximizes the value. And that's why I asked at the beginning, like, what do you mean? Do you mean building or also using? Because all the data, all the visualization, and all the analysis in the world isn't going to do any good if nobody uses it. That's why it's really important to have, I'll call it analytically aware or data aware employees across the board. People should understand and be able to read data. So at my time at eBay, they actually started something called the Analytics University. That was a fantastic concept because they put everybody through that university. I think there were 4 levels, and first train the trainer. They had they brought in a consultancy that trained a group of analysts how to then train other people, and then they went on, and the entire company went through this training course to understand foundational aspects around statistics, visualization, experimentation, because if people can't read your numbers, they're going to misinterpret. They're going to miss the cue. They're not going to see if this is now actually a significant uplift. They're not going to recognize the trends. They're going to use pie charts, things like that. There's just many mistakes that can be made when working with data.
Can I ask, perhaps a side point, do you think that universally some formats of visualization are always or universally more preferred than others? Like, you work across many different functional verticals.
Yeah.
Could you say that, pie charts or bar charts or a certain type of format, if you don't know them well, go with this format for visualization, or is it completely case by case?
Well, there's a few basic principles you can follow. Let's start with the first one. Pie charts are never a good idea. Never. Because they're a waste of space. The mind is trained to try to recognize patterns and size differences And it is much harder to do that in a circle with a slice relative, for instance, to a stack bar chart. You should always choose a stack bar chart before you choose a pie chart. Just there's no good reason except that people like it because it's pretty, but it's actually not. It dilutes the value of the data and information you're trying to display. So that's probably the foundational rule number one. Don't use those. And then there are some fundamentals. And there's, by the way, a really good book, not probably the best book that I know, by Stephen Few. He's the opposite of Edward Tufte. Edward Tufte is more basically graphic designer talking about like infographics and how do you visualize really pretty stuff around stories and maps and all this. It's really interesting, and I find those super inspirational, but that's mostly things you'll have in magazines or things like that. In a business environment, you mostly don't need that. What you need is very clear information. And then there, on the other end of the spectrum, you have Stephen Few. And he talks about all the different details of how to visualize and what to visualize, which type of data and information. And I think you can classify time series, ranking, deviation, distribution, and there's standards how to I'm missing a few, how to do what. A time series, you're going to use a line chart. There's no reason to use a bar chart for a time series. It's just not a good idea.
What book is this? He's done a few, hasn't he? What book would you recommend people view?
I have it right here. Show Me the Numbers.
Show Me the Numbers.
Show Me the Numbers. Yes. That's the best book. I think that was his first book. I'm not quite sure. But that is like the data visualization Bible for business purposes, for that content. And as I was saying, like a time series, you always do a line chart. A ranking, you always do a bar chart. The distribution, you do a stack bar chart, because you can see then starting at the smallest to the largest, because you have both information in one. First of all, you have the ranking, and then you have the distribution of a whole, right? So there are definitely fundamental principles that you can follow just to get the basics right, to make sure that you get the most out of just pretty simple information. Then you can move on to, if you're trying to display a time series and a deviation at the same time, there's good ways to combine a line chart with a bar chart. You put those over, you can overlay them, and then you get a really great visual information about both the deviation in a certain kind of segment, so your specific month, while also being able to see the long-term trend. And then, for instance, what I would always say is you should always have a set time frame. Like I've never understood, unless you're going like super long-term trends, why people show 2 years in a longer chart, in a longer graph, instead of just putting it over each other. You could just go January to December, then you have your current year, and then you have your previous year. You probably have a lighter color, thinner line, dotted line, whatever. But then it's so much harder for the eye and the mind to compare. Okay, there was a March here and March here. Was that higher? Was that lower? Was the next one higher, lower? If you just put them over each other, you immediately see that. And these type of simplifications of grasping information out of the data that you visualize is something that I think is fundamentally important when you're trying to visualize information. And then it comes to the next part of like, if you want to highlight a specific month, change the color, put a line around it, put a box around it, put an arrow on top of it, doesn't matter. Help your audience see what you see, because you're an analyst, you might see it immediately. This might be distributed people that are not, and help them see what you want them to see.
Yeah, that simplification really is or really could be where the power lies for the customer, the user.
Yeah, certainly.
Mark, I'm conscious we are both about to go into another meeting shortly, and I feel like we've slightly touched on several topics that we wanted to go deep into. As we wrap up, in review, what do you think should be the key takeaway about visualization today?
I'd actually like to take it to something that we haven't talked about yet. It's a little weird because aren't we talking about visualization, and now the most important thing is something we haven't talked about yet. But I have a basic like leadership principles around data and analytics, and a few read between the lines is one of them. I think it's really important. Data accuracy is holy. I think if you have bad data, you're not doing a good job as an analyst, full stop. But there's one that is connected to visualization. And by the way, one of them is visualization matters. So that's why I like talking about this a lot. But the next one is tell a story. And we should always keep in mind that data can tell a story. And it's easier for people to follow a story. And if you keep that in mind while you're visualizing your data, you're building graphs, you're embedding them in your report, in your deep dive, in your ad hoc insight, whatever it is. If you can tell a story with your data, then the chances are very high that people are going to understand what the data is telling you. You just provide data and you leave it up to your audience to interpret it, it might not work. But if you tell a story, it will. And then ultimately a decision is made that's in your interest, because also analysts have a view on the data and what it tells, and think like that's what you should be doing. And that's how you're in the driver's seat without being in the driver's seat, because you let the data tell a story and then the decision is clear.
Fantastic. Okay, great. I think we should leave it there for today. And I know that this creates another situation where we'll have another podcast, and I'll try to be more pinpointed in the line of questioning around data or around visualization specifically. Nonetheless, very insightful and nice to get a snippet as to your leadership principles at the end there. So yeah, really appreciate you coming on and giving us all that today, Mark. It's been awesome. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Joseph. Thanks for having me.